This was followed by a faint sound of rumbling that seemed to come from the interior of the house. Outside all was still, and the hot sunshine lay over everything. The sound was repeated. The children looked at each other with large, expectant eyes. Something in the house was moving, was coming nearer. "Have you all lost your tongues?" asked the governess impatiently. "But you see," Nixie said at length, "somebody does live in it now." "And who is he?" "I didn't say it was a man." "Whoever it is, tell me about the person," persisted Miss Lake. "There's really nothing to tell," replied the child, without looking up. "Oh, but there must be something," declared the logical young governess, "or you wouldn't object so much to its being pulled down." Nixie looked puzzled, but Jimbo came to the rescue at once. "But you wouldn't understand if we did tell you," he said in a slow, respectful voice. His tone held a touch of that indescribable scorn heard sometimes in a child's voice, the utter contempt for the stupid, grown-up creature. Miss Lake noticed and felt annoyed. She recognized that she was not getting on well with the children, and it piqued her. She remembered the Colonel's words about knocking the nonsense out of James's head, and she saw that her first opportunity, in fact her first real test, was at hand. "And why, pray, should I not understand?" she asked with some sharpness. "Is the mystery so very great?" For some reason the duty of spokesman now devolved unmistakably upon Jimbo, and very seriously too he accepted the task, standing with his feet firmly planted in the road and his hands in his trousers pockets. "You see, Miss Lake," he began gravely, "we know such a lot of things in there, and they might not like us to tell you about them. They don't know you yet. If they did, it might be different, but you see it isn't." This was rather crushing to the aspiring educator, and the Colonel's instructions gained additional point in the lights of the boy's explanation. "Fiddlesticks!" she laughed. "There's probably nothing at all in there except rats and cobwebs. Things, indeed." "I knew you wouldn't understand," said Jimbo coolly, with no sign of being offended. "How could you?" He glanced at his sisters, gaining so much support from their enigmatical faces that he added, for their especial benefit, "How could she?" "The gardener said so too," chimed in a younger sister, with a vague notion that their precious empty house was being robbed of its glory. "Yes, but, James dear, I do understand perfectly," continued Miss Lake more gently, and wisely ignoring the reference to the authority of the kitchen garden. "Only, you see, I cannot really encourage you in such nonsense." "It isn't nonsense," replied Jimbo with heat. "But believe me, children, it is nonsense. How do you know that there's anything inside? You've never been there." "You can know perfectly well what's inside a thing without having gone there," replied Jimbo with scorn. "At least we can." Miss Lake changed her tack a little, fatally as it appeared afterwards. "I know at any rate," she said with decision, "that there's nothing good in there. Whatever there may be is bad, thoroughly bad, and not fit for you to play with." The other children moved away, but Jimbo stood his ground. They were all angry, disappointed, sore, hurt, and offended. But Jimbo suddenly began to feel something else besides anger and vexation. It was a new point of view to him that the empty house might contain bad things as well as good, or perhaps only bad things. His imagination seized upon the point at once, and set to work vigorously to develop it. This was his way with all such things, and he could not prevent it. "Bad things?" he repeated, looking up at the governess. "You mean things that could hurt?" "Yes, of course," she said, noting the effect of her words, and thinking how pleased the Colonel would be later when he heard it. Things that might run out and catch you some day when you're passing here alone, and take you back a prisoner. Then you'd be a prisoner in the empty house all your life. Think of that." Miss Lake mistook the boy's silence as proof that she was taking the right line. She enlarged upon this view of the matter now that she was so successfully launched, and described the inmate of the house with such wealth of detail that she felt sure her listener would never have anything to do with the place again, and that she had knocked out this particular bit of nonsense for ever and a day. But to Jimbo it was a new and horrible idea that the empty house, haunted hitherto by rather jolly and wonderful Red Indians, contained a monster who might take him prisoner, and the thought made him feel afraid. The mischief had of course been done, and the terror in his eyes was unmistakable when the foolish governess saw her mistake. Retreat was impossible. The boy was shaking with fear, and not all Miss Lake's genuine sympathy or Nixie's explanations and soothings were able to relieve his mind of its new burden. Hitherto Jimbo's imagination had loved to dwell upon the pleasant side of things invisible, but now he had been severely frightened, and his imagination took a new turn. Not only the empty house, but all his inner world, to which it was in some sense the key, underwent a distressing change. His sense of horror had been vividly aroused. The governess would willingly have corrected her mistake, but was, of course, powerless to do so. Bitterly she regretted her tactlessness and folly, but she could do nothing, and to add to her distress she saw that Jimbo shrank from her in a way that could not long escape the watchful eye of the mother. But if the boy shed tears of fear that night in his bed, it must, in justice, be told that she, for her part, cried bitterly in her own room, not that she had endangered her place, but that she had done a cruel injury to a child, and that she was helpless to undo it. For she loved children, though she was quite unsuited to take care of them. Her just reward, however, came swiftly upon her. A few nights later, when Jimbo and Nixie were allowed to come down to dessert, the wind was heard to make a queer moaning sound in the wisteria tree that hung over the dining-room windows. Jimbo heard it too. He held his breath for a minute, then he looked round the table in a frightened way, and the next minute gave a scream and burst into tears. He ran round and buried his face in his father's arms. After the tears came the truth. It was a bad thing for Miss Ethel Lake, this little joke of the wind and the wisteria tree, for the gin of terror she had thoughtlessly evoked swept into the room and introduced himself to the parents without her leave. "What new nonsense is this now?" growled the soldier, leaving his walnuts and lifting the boy onto his knee. "He shouldn't come down till he's a little older and knows how to behave." "What's the matter, darling child?" asked the mother, drying his eyes tenderly. "I heard the bad things crying in the empty house." "The empty house is a mile away from here," snorted the Colonel. "But it's come nearer," declared the frightened boy. "Who told you there were bad things in the empty house?" asked the mother. "Yes, who told you, indeed, I would like to know?" demanded the Colonel. Then it all came out. The Colonel's wife was very quiet, but very determined. Miss Lake went back to the clerical family whence she had come, and the children knew her no more. "I'm glad," said Nixie, voicing the verdict of the nursery. "I thought she was awfully stupid." "She wasn't a real lake at all," declared another. "She was only a sort of puddle." Jimbo, however, said little, and the Colonel likewise held his peace. But the governess, whether she was a lake or only a puddle, left her mark behind her. The empty house was no longer harmless. It had a new lease on life. It was tenanted by someone who could never have friendly relations with children. The weeds in the old garden took on fantastic shapes, Figures hid behind the door.